In the spring of 1962, in the Stanley Cup playoffs, Stan Mikita skated into a series many expected to belong to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Every time number 21 touched the puck, the crowd booed, yet shift after shift, he carved through defenders, slipped passes through tiny seams, and snapped wrist shots past stunned goalies. By the end of that run, he had 6 goals and 15 assists in 12 games, 21 points in total, breaking Gordie Howe's playoff scoring record and forcing the league to admit that this was more than a dirty agitator. How did a kid who had been bullied and shunned for his accent and his temper, and then hated as the little devil of Chicago, turn into the player driving one of the most feared offenses in hockey? Before we begin, please subscribe and turn on notifications to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Thank you very much. Back in Sokolce in 1940, in a flat farming village of Czechoslovakia, he was born into a family that owned almost nothing except hard work. The house was small, with one main room, a tiny kitchen, and no running water. The world outside was sliding into war, and the new borders that would later lock Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain were already casting their shadow. For a boy who loved to chase a ball or a piece of wood across the yard, there was no real path to a bigger stage. That path only appeared when an aunt and uncle returned from Canada, saw this quick, restless child, and quietly asked his parents a question that would change all of their lives. Would they let their son leave everything he knew for a distant country he could barely imagine? When he arrived in St. Catharines in Ontario, he was the only child in his class who did not speak English. On the first days at school, classmates pointed at him, laughed, and mimicked strange sounds when he tried to answer. Some called him the foreign kid, some told him to sit at the back, and when he did not understand, they laughed even harder. At recess, snowballs were aimed at his head a little more often, shoves into the lockers came a little harder, and no one chose him first for games. The rink was not kinder at the beginning. Older boys slashed at his hands, hooked his skates, and sneered at his accent when he tried to say a few words. It was a clear message that he did not really belong. Since words failed him, he started to answer in the only language he trusted, with hits, with his stick, and with a temper that slowly became part of his identity. Hockey first felt like a refuge. On frozen outdoor rinks and in small arenas around St. Catharines, he could move without needing words. Teachers still saw an immigrant kid, but coaches saw something else. He read the play a step ahead, slipped into open ice, and treated the puck like an old friend. He was not the biggest or the fastest, yet shifts changed when he jumped over the boards. Soon he was starring for the St. Catharines Teepees in junior, piling up points while taking important face-offs and killing penalties. Scouts from Chicago watched this small, stubborn center control games against older players and decided they wanted him in their future more than they feared his temper. When he first joined the main roster of the Chicago Blackhawks at the end of the 1950s, he walked into the dressing room carrying the same hard feelings he had built up on those schoolyards in Ontario. On the ice, he was a center who could control the puck, but he was also a man who refused to step aside. In his first full seasons in the NHL, his penalty minutes climbed into the triple digits. Late slashes, heavy cross-checks in the corners, and sharp words for opponents and officials turned him into a marked man. Home fans loved that edge. Many visiting fans did not. In arenas across the league, boos rained down every time number 21 jumped over the boards. In French-speaking rinks, supporters of the other side began to call him the Little Devil, a nickname that carried both fear and contempt. At the same time, his skill could not be ignored. In the spring of 1961, he led Chicago in goals during the Stanley Cup run, helping deliver a championship to a city that had waited decades. To teammates, he was already the heartbeat of the attack, even as much of the league still saw only the villain. In the years after that first Stanley Cup, the Little Devil did not calm down, but his talent grew too big to ignore. Through the early and mid-1960s, he turned into the engine of Chicago's offense. Shift after shift, he carried the puck through the neutral zone, slipped past checks, and found wingers in stride. He began to finish seasons near the top of league scoring, stacking 70 and 80-point campaigns in an era when goals were harder to come by. Twice in that decade, he claimed the Art Ross Trophy as the leading scorer in the Yet the Numbers Told Half the Story. The penalty minutes were still high, the arguments with officials still loud, and fans in other cities still treated him as a villain. Writers described him as the kind of player you hated unless he wore your colors. Inside the Chicago room, there was no doubt. Teammates knew that when their team needed a goal, the puck would find his stick and the gam. The turning point did not come from a coach, a referee, or a league fine. It came from a little girl sitting in a living room, watching her father on television. One night, she saw him once again in the small glass box beside the ice and asked why he spent so much time there instead of playing with his team. For a man who had fought his way through schoolyards and into the NHL by never backing down, that simple question cut deeper than any slash. He realized that the image his own child carried of him was not the leader, not the playmaker, but the man who was always being punished. From that season on, something shifted. The elbows and late hits disappeared. The stick work quietened, while the hands with the puck became even more creative. Penalty minutes dropped to a fraction of what they had been, yet his points did not fall. In back-to-back years in the late 1960s, he did what no one else has done, leading the league in scoring while also being voted both the most valuable player and the most sportsmanlike. The little devil had turned himself into a gentleman without losing his edge. As his reputation changed, his curiosity about the tools of the game never stopped. One day in practice, after a stick blade was accidentally wedged and bent, he noticed how the puck jumped off it with a strange, wicked spin. Instead of throwing that stick away, he leaned into the discovery. Soon, he was heating blades, bending them by hand, and learning how a curved blade could launch wrist shots and slap shots that dipped and swerved in ways goalies had never seen. Along with a few daring teammates, he pushed the banana blade so far that the league eventually stepped in and set strict limits on how much curve was allowed. He did not only look at his stick. After a deflected shot tore part of his ear, he began wearing a helmet full-time at a moment when many stars refused to protect their heads. He also worked with people who were experimenting with lighter shells and better straps. On the ice, his style matched that same mindset. He might not have been the fastest skater, but he saw the play early, won faceoffs cleanly, and controlled the tempo with calm, precise decisions that made his teammates better. By the early 1970s, he was no longer just a star. He was the face of Chicago hockey. That was exactly when the World Hockey Association arrived with open checkbooks. A new team in Chicago tried to pry him away with a contract worth well over $1 million, a huge signing bonus and long-term security that very few players of that era ever saw. For a man who had grown up without running water, it was the kind of offer that could change a family for generations. He listened, he negotiated, but in the end, he stayed. He chose to keep wearing the same sweater, in the same city that had booed him at first, and then claimed him as Mr. Blackhawk. Through the early 70s, he kept piling up points, playing hurt through back trouble and a fractured heel, and delivering more big nights at Chicago Stadium. When he pulled on the maple leaf for Canada in 1972, and later skated in Prague as a visiting hero, the story felt complete. The boy who once left Eastern Europe with a suitcase now carried the respect of both his new country and the one he had left behind. Away from the noise of the rink, he tried to live by one simple idea. Without people buying tickets, there would be no life in hockey and no food on the family table. At restaurants, he stood up to sign autographs even when his children were annoyed, then explained to them that respect for fans was not negotiable. That same sense of responsibility guided him toward people who had even fewer advantages than the boy from Sokolchi once had. In the 1970s, he helped create a hockey school for children who were deaf or hard of hearing, giving them ice time, coaching, and a place where being different did not mean standing alone. He pulled younger teammates into Special Olympics events and community work, teaching by example rather than speeches. By the time his injured back forced him to retire in 1980, his body was worn down, but his standing in Chicago was firm. His number 21 was raised to the rafters and later a bronze statue went up outside the arena. The little devil who once filled penalty boxes was now frozen in metal as a symbol of the club itself. Years after leaving the ice, a new kind of battle started. First came a diagnosis of cancer in his mouth, caught early enough to treat. Later, the news was more cruel. Doctors told his family that he was living with Lewy body dementia, a disease that slowly steals memory, movement, and clarity. The man who had once read every play a second before anyone else now struggled to follow simple conversations or remember the games that had made his name. There were chances to join lawsuits and blame the sport for what had happened. His family chose instead to focus on caring for him with dignity. Even as his mind slipped, certain habits stayed. He still greeted people with a firm handshake, still stepped aside to let others pass through a doorway, still adjusted a golf grip for his son on the green. When he died at 78, the tribute spoke of a player, a father, and a gentleman whose impact outlasted his own memories. In the end, his story is not only written in goals, assists, or trophies. It is written in the journey from a frightened boy who did not understand the language in his classroom, to a hot-headed little devil who filled penalty boxes, and finally to a man trusted to carry the hopes of a city and the quiet struggles of children who could not hear the roar of the crowd. The league changed its rules because of his curved blade, and teams changed their habits because of his helmet. But the people closest to him remember other details. They remember the way he shook hands, the way he showed up for young players and for families in the stands, and the way he tried to make sure that no child felt as alone as he once did. Maybe that is the real legacy. A life that began with being pushed to the edges of every room ended with a bronze statue at the center of a hockey city. Do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out more great hockey stories right here on the channel. Your support truly means a lot to us. Thank you for watching.